going to start now. Would you mind just introducing yourself, saying like your name, what you do here at IU, just to begin with?
Sure. Okay. I'm Heather Akou. I'm an associate professor of fashion design, and I'm also the director of the Elizabeth Sage Historic Costume Collection.
And so, like, what have been your kind of specialties of study here?
Well, my areas of specialty have been African dress and fashion, Islamic fashion, and I recently have been doing some things on uniforms. I recently submitted an article for publication about prison uniforms, and I'm working on some things now about working class uniforms, like especially minimum wage jobs. I'm kind of interested in anything that doesn't usually show up in fashion collections.
Perfect. So kind of against the grain already.
Yes.
So going off of that, with like what you've studied with Islamic fashion and whatnot, I'm sure politics has a lot greater influence in that sort of fashion and culture. So could you speak a little on that and how it compares to how politics affect fashion like here in the US?
Sure. I mean, all of those things I just mentioned have a political dimension. I mean, even my first book, which is about the history of Somali dress, the title of the book is The Politics of Dress and Somali Culture. So this has been a really strong, consistent theme through my work. I mean, Islamic fashion in the US, it's a very small minority community, but at the same time, I mean, it's something that's a real hot button issue. It has been, especially since September 11th. So really for almost 2 decades now, this has been a big issue. Hate crimes rose after September 11th. They've also risen again recently in the last few years. And people are targeted based on the way they appear. Muslims are very well aware of this. There's great concern within the community about how safe is it to dress in certain ways? Does it mean that I should stay in my home? Do I risk it? Do I change the way I dress? So even though Islamic dress is not worn for political reasons, it is a political issue in this country, and people who wear Islamic dress do absolutely consider how it might impact them.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So branching away from like religion to and maybe dress that's overtly worn as like a statement of your religion, how would you say that that really affects, like, I guess we would think of it as almost the everyday American, which is a terrible way of thinking because Muslims and like everyone of every religion is an everyday American.
Right.
But I guess when you're thinking in the fashion context overall, you're not thinking every single person wears a hijab or like wears so on and so forth. So how would you compare that in like a political fashion lens?
Well, I guess a couple of ways. So one thing to know about Islamic fashion is that it's entering the mainstream not just as a media image, but also on a retail level. So for example, Macy's last year became the first mainstream US retailer to sell specifically to Muslims and to, you know, have garments designed and sold specifically for that population. They sold out almost immediately. I managed to get a few to put in our collection. But there was clearly some demand there. And I mean, I've seen, you know, people wearing them outside who it was clearly their own individual decision. So that's really interesting, kind of exciting. But certainly, I mean, political statements, some people are very aware of political statements. I think another really good analogous group right now would be the Black Lives Matter movement. There absolutely are, you know, slogans, mottos that people are putting on t-shirts. They want their political position to be known. They want it to be visible. And I mean, I think that's something that people have always done, but the fact now that you can, you know, order something on Cafe Press or, you know, some website, you can just get your custom t-shirts printed within days and have them shipped to you, really increases the possibilities for people to express their political opinions in their clothing very quickly.
Do you think that that's this generation, sort of how like in the 70s, sort of the political statement was like making your own clothes, wearing your own clothes, going against like demand, the big consumerism. Do you think that that's kind of this generation's statement, is having it worn like directly on the front of your shirt?
Right. I mean, there's still some do-it-yourself, you know, political clothing. For example, I didn't even know we had these, but a couple weeks ago, I looked at a pair of pants from our collection that somebody had found in the trash here on campus, and they had anarchist symbols all over them. And that's a great example. And they were very clearly, you know, do it yourself. It was a pair of pants that someone had heavily modified with patches. You know, I have no idea where all of those patches came from, but it was a very clear political statement and definitely something that it was handmade. Kind of the other end of the spectrum of that is something like Hot Topic. You know, you can go buy a Black Panther t-shirt and wear that. And that is kind of a political symbol, but it's a really commodified political symbol. So it doesn't demonstrate any real depth. I mean, it could, but it's very different from, customizing and laboring over a pair of pants for hours. Like, that demonstrates a different level of political commitment.
Definitely. And I think a major issue that this generation poses, and what your opinion may be on this, is the commodity of like having a statement is very big, and it's very powerful for getting attention. And so do you think that really like juxtaposes what it started as, like the counterculture in the 60s and the 70s?
Right. Yeah, I mean, the great thing about commodification is that you can, if people are kind of rallying around a particular message, you can make a lot of them very quickly and get it out there, and that's really exciting. I mean, thinking about, like, for example, the survivors of the Parkland shooting. I mean, they also had some symbols that came out very quickly, and people started wearing those shirts. Like, that was a really spontaneous thing that did end up, in the commercial market, but it was, it was a groundswell that it came from, grassroots level activism and very quickly blew up, and people wanted a part of it. Not all political movements work like that.
Do you think some political movements are almost like a trend?
They definitely can be, yeah.
And what do you think it takes to make them like more long-lasting, like have longevity past just like, oh, people are talking about this in the news right now, so that's what's popular?
Well, here's a good example in that respect. So 2016, when Trump was inaugurated, was the Women's March, and you might remember the pussy hats, the pink hats. And there were lots of people who made those themselves. Some people call themselves craftivists, and they, very pointedly make political things in their crafting activity, which is satisfying on many levels. It's probably not their job. It's something they do, just as a hobby to make a statement. But certainly there were also a lot of people who went to that march who wore the pussy hat, and they will never wear it again because they didn't continue to be active in the movement. It was just kind of a one-time event. And so, that's something easy to commodify and sell commercially, like, here's this t-shirt you can wear to this march. Great. But if you don't have any, activism or commitment deeper than that, it's just gonna disappear. The t-shirt is almost meaningless.
So going off of all of that kind of put together, what's your definition of counterculture today?
Well, I was wondering, in fact, what your definition of counterculture was, because, I mean, that term kind of came about during the Vietnam War era, where it was like hippie, dirty hippies who were making a very clear statement through their address, which was, we don't want to be drafted, we don't think this war is okay, screw you and your mainstream culture. Like, that was men were growing their hair long, and people were wearing tie-dye and jeans, and, flower children with their open sexual, activity. And so that was like the original, kind of counterculture movement. But there are other kinds of counterculture today where people are, making the same kind of political statements, but there are more of them, and it's more diverse today. So it doesn't, people might think, oh, there's no real counterculture anymore. There absolutely is. It's just more fragmented. So you have a lot of different expressions of counterculture movements. Maybe not the same as 1970s, but they have not gone away.
No, I completely agree. I think like starting out with the 70s, it was almost specifically political, and it did like influence the way people dress, because that's your number one way to get something across is the way that you look, because people are going to see you before they hear you. And so I think that that's huge. But like today, like you said, it's so much more broad. There's politics, there's culture in general, there's religion, there's sexuality and gender. Like there's so much more. And so I thought that's like kind of what made the topic so interesting. And especially with like the hipster movement per se, is that people were almost using counterculture as a novelty.
Right.
And so,
right.
I thought that was completely interesting, that it was like, now it's almost like glorified, and it's really cool to be going against the grain. And you have people that do that just for attention, and then you have people that do that because it's like their true selves. So
absolutely.
Exactly. I think that's kind of like where I'm going with it. So like branching away from counterculture too, what would you say is like the life cycle of a trend right now?
Well, it really depends, because changes in dress can happen really slowly, and they can happen really quickly. So something that might be a fad. I remember a couple years ago, I was teaching aesthetics, and the thing on the runway show was free the nips, like show your nipples on the runway, which to me was like, why would anyone do that? But that's what, fad fashion is like, right? Like you can do anything and the more shocking, the better. But that wasn't a trend that was really going to catch on or have any longevity unless it became attached to some kind of, deeper meaning. If people who, like feminists, for example, feel really strongly about, heck yeah, we should be able to show our chests all the time, and they really grabbed hold of that as a political symbol, it could become long lasting. But it didn't, and it's become a good example of something that was very short-lived. Whereas the idea of women wearing pants, that seemed equally radical in the 1960s. In schools, for example, the dress code would say girls can't wear pants. It's skirts and dresses, and that's it. And so it seemed radical at the time, and now it seems radical to say women shouldn't wear pants. It's really gone completely in the opposite direction. So that's a much slower trend, but it's one that's really taken hold.
And so do you think that sort of like counterculture as like a very like minor incorporation, not necessarily minor in its actions, but I guess like a quiet interpretation throughout the way?
It can be. It doesn't have to be a huge splashy thing. Sometimes changes that are ultimately end up becoming really important happen slowly over time.
Definitely. And so would you say that the life cycle of a trend too changes according to like whatever our culture, our political environment, like so on and so forth? Do you think it changes according to those things, or do you think it kind of stays that constant?
Kind of yes and no. Certainly, fashion does respond to things that are happening economically, artistically. Changes in materials can impact how fashion changes. There are a lot of things, like the idea that fashion changes and there are always new things, like that's just normal. That's really always been the case, especially in the last couple of centuries, since more people have had much more access to a greater volume of clothing. Like we can afford to buy a cheap t-shirt today, whereas 200 years ago, most working people only owned a couple sets of clothing, so there wasn't as much opportunity for expression, at least in their clothing. They did make expressions in other ways with their accessories and things they would do with their bodies, but certainly there was less opportunity. So that kind of like turmoil and constant change I don't see going away. It's always responding to different things. People are always looking for what's the new thing. But there are slower, deeper trends that happen over time. Think about like gender expression today. In the Victorian era, there were men and there were women, and there really wasn't anything in between. There were rare people who managed some kind of in-between expression. Like there were biological men who performed as women on stage, for example, but they couldn't just walk down the street dressed like that. Even today, it's a physical risk to do that. But I do think there have been tremendous changes in the last 20 years with LGBTQ people and their ability to be more open about their gender and sexual identity. So, sometimes things do change really fast.
Definitely, sometimes really slow.
Sometimes really slow.
Yeah. I was doing an interview yesterday where someone commented that my generation necessarily, which is like the cusp of the millennial and the Gen Z, like that debated territory, we don't really have necessarily like a look of our own. Like everyone knows when you say 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even up to the 90s and kind of 2000s, which was atrocious. Everyone knows the look in their head. But our generation is really like recycled trends. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I guess just like, political expression and dress, there's so many more opportunities now. And vintage shopping, secondhand shopping has become a huge thing because it's environmentally sustainable, it's often more affordable. People like finding old things that are unique that they can repurpose. And so that has really, 1950s, people were not buying secondhand clothing, or if they were, it certainly wasn't fashionable. So that has really, broadened the possibilities for what we can wear.
And definitely. Do you think that's what makes like kind of trend recycling popular?
Yeah, why not? We have such a buffet of things that we can purchase today. It's not surprising that you see so many different kinds of expression, which in many ways is great because we don't all look good in the same things. And so, I'm 6 feet tall. Like I'm not, an average size woman. So for me, vintage shopping has never been exciting because I just don't fit in most of the clothes. But if you're of the right size, it can be very exciting. And so it's great seeing someone wearing, some cool, vintage dress from the 1950s. Like, that's great. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they think, you know, I belong in the 1950s. It's not necessarily an expression that way of their politics, but, you know, it's a style.
Definitely. Okay, I think that's really all I had.